Now, I'm Andrew Parsons, Vice President of the Watchful Chapel Society, and along with fellow trustee Jackson Marville and the music director, Andrew Howe, we organized this free admission summer program of 3 speakers and 2 concerts. And this is the final event of the summer program. But I'm pleased to say that the trustees have agreed to continue and extend this concert and speaker program in 2024. And if you have a particular idea for us to consider as a 2024 theme for the speaker program, please let us know soon, because we have to develop the program and book speakers a long time in advance. But certainly welcome your ideas of an interesting program of several lecture speakers next year. Now, we gave this year's speaker program the thematic title of Solving the Mysteries of the Scriptures. And firstly, we had Professor Joel Baden of Yale, who spoke about the writing and assembling of the Hebrew Scriptures, the Hebrew Bible, which is the Old Testament to Christians. Then Jim Vanderkam, Professor Emeritus of Yale, of Notre Dame, spoke about discovery and content of Dead Sea Scrolls. And today, Professor Michael Peppard of Fordham University will speak about the writers of the New Testament. And there is a handout which gives the synopsis of his talk at the back, and it'll probably be a useful aide-memoire anyway after this lecture today. Michael has a PhD in religious studies from Yale, and he had prior degrees from Yale Divinity School and from Notre Dame. He is a prolific writer, I would say, of books and articles, both popular and academic, on the early Christian church and the nexus of religion, politics, and culture. And there's a more detailed biography in the program about his many achievements, scholastic and literary achievements. So I'd like to welcome Michael to Watchful Chapel and enjoy the view.
Thank you so much. It is indeed a lovely view, and you should all stand up here at some point to take it in. I was just saying to my wife, Rebecca, that I can imagine the pastors who come here on a visiting Sunday are very happy and might want to stay. It's quite lovely. So thank you for the invitation. It's a wonderful intellectual speaker series you've put together this summer, and quite inspiring, honestly. I was asked to talk about the development of the New Testament as a set of sacred scripture, and we will get to quite a bit of that in just a few minutes, but I want to start by thinking about a more general topic, and that is about memory and about how memory becomes history through storytelling. So a more generalized topic, and I ask you to ponder for yourself, what was the first major event in your life that you remember? Something that cut through the noise of the everyday and maybe even feels like it was lodged in your brain, leaving something like a scar in your mind. Now, if we were teaching class, of course, we'd break out into small groups and talk about this. But we're just going to do a thought experiment right here, and perhaps you have yours. I choose the scar tissue metaphor with intention because studies have shown that many such events, one's first major memories, have some kind of trauma involved or some kind of shock. Many people remember an accident or a fire or a family separation or an earthquake or some other kind of breach of the ordinary. For me, I think I remember breaking my leg at age 3.5. but I can't be sure that I remember this because I saw so many photographs of it afterwards, and it became such a defining feature of my childhood, seeing pictures of myself in this wheelchair and all of that. But I'm sure that I remember a different event because I was alone and no one else really talked about it afterwards, which was looking out the glass door into our little backyard and seeing the lawn underwater from a series of storms. And this is an inversion of the ordinary. Why is the lawn underwater, where I could see the grass underneath? This is, I think, my first memory that I have. Then when I think about the first memory of a public event, something that everyone experienced, for me this is January 1986, when the Space Shuttle Challenger exploded shortly after takeoff. And I was of the age as a boy where I was very interested in such things, in airplanes and outer space and astronauts. Now, I thought I remembered where I was exactly when this happened, right? I have a memory of this, until I became a scholar later in life, and I read about what Ulrich Neisser, a psychologist of memory, calls flashbulb memory. And it turns out Ulrich Neisser's most famous experiment, when he was a professor at Emory, has come to be called the Challenger experiment. Because he was a scholar of memory, and the day after the Challenger explosion, he had his intro psychology class of hundreds and hundreds of students at Emory University in Atlanta. And what does a good scholar do? Well, he used it as an experiment. And he gave a survey of 7 questions to all the students in his class about basic things. Did you see it happen live? Where were you? Who were you with? Etc. And then 2.5 years later, he gave all of them the same survey. And then he was able to have a good data set about what he calls flashbulb memory of an emotional sort of big event in one's life. And he asked them a series of questions, and to cut to the chase, you're not going to feel good about this. Nobody likes the results of this, so maybe I shouldn't even start with it, but here we go. Only 10% of the students had accurate memories of what should have been a big event that they remembered. 25% had nothing correct. Nothing correct about what they were doing that day, where they were, who they were with. And you ready? It's going to get worse. The ones who were least correct were still very confident, because he added a question that rated their confidence in their answers. And so what he found is that there was excellent memory of the general event and very, very poor, inconsistent memory of the details surrounding the event. And there was no correlation between accuracy of memory and confidence. This is frightening, right? And so why do I start with it? I start with it because when we talk about the New Testament, and especially the Gospels, oftentimes people are talking about eyewitness testimony. Did this really happen? Who was there when Jesus did this or said that? And the reason I start with this is to destabilize memory overall, not just memory about ancient things or ancient people's memories, but all of our memories. But it's not all bad. It's not all sad, because this feature of ours is actually productive. What we do, what psychologists say that we do, is that we create story with our memories. And we do this to create coherence out of the world that we experience. And we're doing it all the time. And we have to just kind of live with that and accept that about ourselves, and then try to learn to analyze what stories are we creating through the process of memorialization and memory. So a second related experimental insight about memory is about the power of questions. And I won't go into all the details here, but there's another famous psychologist who's known for who started this series of research. The long story short of this line of research is that if you're walking around thinking about your memory as something like file folders on your computer or in your house that you go in and retrieve ideas out of or thoughts out of, the field of psychology tells us that that is just false. That metaphor that we're all walking around with is not really how it works. It's much more like a conversation. You're asking questions, and people are asking questions of you, and you're asking questions of your own mind, and you are basically producing story in the present, about your past that has a kind of two-way dialogue. So the power of questions is the second important insight about memory, that we're always bringing questions to our texts and to our history that are going to produce the kind of answers that we get. And the very first writers of the New Testament, whether it's Paul or Matthew or Mark or whoever, they also were doing this because they're humans just like us, and they were producing story through the process of questioning of the things that they experienced. The third point third framing point is then about storytelling. And there's a famous philosopher named Hayden White who articulates a lot of this. And what he argues, and others that follow in his footsteps argue, is say that now for memories to become collective memory, the things that we all remember as a culture, they almost always have to be put in the form of a story. They need characters, they need plot, they need a climax, they need conflict, they need resolution. And these are devices that we often learn and associate with fiction, with stories that are not true. And so it's a little bit uncomfortable there too, that even the way we talk about nonfiction often takes a plot structure for us to understand it. Now let's get very mundane. How can we understand this one? Forget the Challenger, we're gonna be happy now. Let's think about something like baseball. So let's say there was a game yesterday and the Red Sox, are we in Red Sox country? Okay, so I'm over the line. Let's say we're in a Red Sox game, we're at Fenway yesterday, and so we all know a game happened in the past, right? Yesterday. There was an event. Certainly we know what happened yesterday in the game, right? We can be sure of this. But what do you find out is that immediately upon the game's ending, what happens? Everyone in the press box creates a story. They even call it write a story, right? That's what they do. They file their story. They create a plot to the game. They have a rising action. They have a climax. They have someone who's the hero. They have someone who made a big mistake. And they create basically a plot structure to tell the history of yesterday's game. But we can keep going with this for hours, as you can imagine I might do in my classes, because then you can have a story that's a week long. Maybe someone got injured in that game. Maybe it was a season-ending injury, and someone writes a longer story about the career arc of this great player whose season ended last night. Or maybe there was a foul ball who injured a fan in the stands. And for everyone surrounding that event, that's the story. Whatever happened on the field, they're going to forget. But they'll remember that I saw this person get hit with a foul ball. And that's the story of their game, right? Of the memory that they have of that day. So with these ideas in mind, just a few of the things that help me think about the past, the way we produce memories, the way we interrogate our memories like a conversation to create story, and the way those stories take plot structures, let's look at the New Testament with some of those ideas in mind. So we have a text about the baptism of Jesus here. And we're going to read this together. I did have this one other framing device very briefly to bring in, because the Gospels, of course, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and other texts that are written about the life of Jesus, they are written fundamentally about the life of a person who has passed away and who is gone. And so I often also sometimes think about the ways that we produce story about people that we know who have passed on. I have not been to a funeral recently, thankfully, but I've been to very many of them. And I often think about when we're memorializing a person's life, as Jesus' life was memorialized, that the kinds of things that happen at a wake, at a funeral, on the car rides, at the meals around that, there's some of the same questions that actually I ask as a scholar, because you hear stories and you think, is that really true? Did so-and-so do that? And then you hear another story and you think, is that coherent? I thought they said that she went to Venezuela then, but now they're saying that she was here, and you're trying to line up these multiple versions of things. And then sometimes you hear stories that are embarrassing and you think, well, did the family cover that up? Or why didn't I ever hear that story before? And so we have all of these real life, regular ways we're doing history and analyzing stories. And some of that we bring to the study of our text. So in the Gospels, the Gospel of Mark and the Gospel of Matthew share many of the same stories. One of these is the baptism of Jesus. It also happens to be discussed, narrated also in the Gospel of Luke and in the Gospel of John. So on the Gospel of Mark's side, it's quite a short account. It happened in those days that Jesus came from Nazareth of Galilee and was baptized in the Jordan by John. To be baptized means to go underwater and to come back up again. That's all the Greek word means. On coming up out of the water, he saw the heavens being torn open and the Spirit like a dove descending upon him. And a voice came from the heavens, "You are my beloved Son, with you I am well pleased." Now, in the Gospel of Matthew's version, we have, of course, a lot of similarities. But as I read, note the slight differences. Then Jesus came from Galilee to John at the Jordan to be baptized by him. John tried to prevent him. So there's a conversation. And the conversation has an intention that's declared by the narrator. John tried to prevent him, saying, "I need to be baptized by you, and yet you are coming to me?" Jesus said to him in reply, "Allow it now, or let it happen, permit it, for thus it is fitting for us to fulfill all righteousness." And then he allowed him. After Jesus was baptized, he came up from the water, and behold, the heavens were opened, and he saw the Spirit of God descending like a dove and coming upon him. And a voice came from the heavens saying, "This is my beloved Son, with whom I am well pleased." Now, again, if you were unlucky enough to be in Professor Peppard's Intro to New Testament class, we would break up in small groups and we would talk about such things. But I ask you just to ponder in your mind what you saw, what differences you might have seen, and what they might mean. So this conversation, John tries to prevent him. It seems like there is some concern about who has power and authority in this event. He's saying, well, wait, why are you coming to me to be baptized? That might make it seem like I have some kind of power over you, but you're the one that I think has authority, so maybe we shouldn't be doing it in this way. And what the reader of these texts, or the listener in the ancient world, the listener would also know is that baptism has already been described as for repentance. And that's what the purpose of the event is, the purpose of the ritual. It's a kind of mini pilgrimage for repentance. So then perhaps the early Christian community is thinking, well, if Jesus was baptized, then does that mean he had to repent? And if he did, what does that mean about his origin? That doesn't totally cohere with what we believe about him. So what I'm getting at is that the Gospel of Matthew has here in this text responded to some of the questions that are already being asked about the memory of the baptism in the mid-first century. Is already responding to some of those questions. In addition, in Mark's version of what happens, it says the Spirit, and there's no capital letters in the ancient Greek here, so there's no difference. So it's just the word Spirit. And if you look on the Gospel of Matthew side, you note that it clarifies this is the Spirit of God that descends. Now that may not seem like a big deal if you know how Christian theology develops and the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit and all of that. But in the ancient world, everybody believed that there were lots and lots of spirits all over, wandering around in this room right now, swirling about. Our bodies are porous to them, right? This is a very normal belief in all of the pre-modern world and a lot of the world still today. And so Matthew wants to clarify, well, this wasn't just any old spirit. This was the Spirit of God. It wasn't another kind of power that came into Jesus at the baptism. And then finally, we have this voice from heaven. And it looks very, very close. It is very close. But Mark's version says you are, and Matthew says this is. It's a very small difference, but if you read the Gospel of Mark all the way through, and the Gospel of Matthew all the way through, you'll find that this lines up very well with tendencies of these two authors, in that Mark has a much more private, almost secretive identity of who Jesus is. And so Mark's version makes it seem like this is an individual epiphany, a private revelation to a person, whereas Matthew seems like a declaration of this identity to everyone. So Jesus' baptism would seem to be a flashbulb memory option, right? An explosion, a visual and auditory epiphany of the founding leader, who's carrying the mantle forward from John the Baptizer and carrying it on. But in fact, in the four Gospels, we have slightly different memories, memorializations, and stories about what's here. And you can imagine as a New Testament, if you're a New Testament scholar, and at this point, maybe you're thinking, I'm glad I was not a New Testament scholar, but you could imagine that we might do this same kind of thinking process with every single story in the Gospels and beyond. So we can think about where these stories fit into the plots that create meaning in the Gospels of Mark and Matthew and beyond. Now, what I want to do with the rest of our time is think about the formation of the New Testament with three different chronological stories. And on the handout, I've said a 100-year story, a 400-year story, and a 1,500-year story. We'll get to that in the third hour of my talk. No, I'm just kidding. Ha ha. No. You already came in from the beach for this, so we can't keep you that long. What is the 100-year story? The 100-year story of the New Testament starts with oral storytelling. Starts with the stories that Jesus himself told. He told many parables, stories drawn from nature or common life that called people to reflect on their relationship with God or their relationship with their fellow human beings and their ethics. We also have the preaching of people like Peter and Paul and the storytelling of Jesus' mother Mary and Mary Magdalene after that. We have the memories of those people Jesus healed who are telling stories in their towns and villages where they went home to. And so before anything is written down, we have absolutely a foundation of orality and of oral storytelling. But when the writings did begin, I would say they began along two main pathways, the writings themselves. And the first main pathway is a pathway of letters called epistles, from the Greek word for letter, or we can just call them letters. Now, how and why did this happen, this first main pathway? The rapid and broad spread of Christianity, especially as led by this charismatic figure named Paul, was founding small house churches, small communities all around the Mediterranean in cities and towns. And when he would leave town, this necessitated a letter-writing correspondence between the communities he started and himself wherever he was along the road. And they had a lot of questions for him about what he taught or what he had forgotten to teach or hadn't even thought to teach, right? Can we get married? Can we get married outside of our group? If someone sacrifices meat to a Greek god in the marketplace and it looks really good, beautiful lamb chops, can I eat them if it was sacrificed to Athena or Zeus or something? This is a good question. Do we have to be fully vegetarian? What about my grandmother who just died? Where is she, Paul? And is she going to come back? Or what do we do with this? So they have lots of questions for him that are about these theological matters. And so our first pathway of Christian writing is letters that are responding to these questions. Another main pathway is what comes to be called the Gospels. And these are writings about the life and death and resurrection of Jesus of Nazareth. His wondrous beginnings, his many miracles, his many teachings, his tragic end, his glorious reappearing. And so there are questions that the Gospels want to ask, like where was he from, right? Who was his family? What was his town? What was his origin story? Obviously, what did he teach? But maybe more importantly even, where did he get his power? Where did he get his authority? What were the challenges that he faced? And in the end, why did he die? Why was he executed? All of the Gospels in some way are written to answer those questions. And so this second main pathway of Gospels narrates events that came before the letters, but the Gospels are likely written entirely after the letters, if that makes sense. So our earliest glimpses of Christianity are actually through Paul's letters, if we're looking chronologically. but the Gospels are written later about events that happened earlier. So this core kind of continues to stabilize around these two pathways. And then it's not a very fancy thing, but it's kind of letters, Gospels, and other, honestly. The other group, the book of Acts, early history of the church, the book of Revelation, a series of visionary prophecies about the end times. And then we have several other epistles, letters written by other figures who are not Paul, that are on the boundaries in that first 100-year story, but eventually are part of the New Testament canon. Even as I say that, and we're about to turn to the 400-year story, I also want to clarify that there are many other writings being produced by people who absolutely thought of themselves as within this emerging Christian milieu. And they did not think to themselves, I'm going to sit down and write a non-canonical story. No one is thinking that at that point. They're all trying to write the story of Jesus and Jesus' followers in the best way that they know how, for the purposes that they have. And so the 400-year story is really where we get more of the decision-making process. So we might turn to that. Now, I noticed from the talks last year, right, about you had Frank Clooney on Hinduism and Gabriel Said Reynolds on Islam and others, so talks about great religions of the world. I sometimes think about how unusual the New Testament is as a set of sacred scripture in comparison to many of the other sacred scriptures of the world. And so, for one example, not one word of it was dictated by the founder, meaning there was no time where Jesus said, here, write this down for posterity. I want everyone to know about this, right? Which is quite surprising, actually, considering how much he was a rabbi and teacher. So that's one unusual fact about the Gospels. And then an unusual fact about the letters is simply that 21 of the 27 texts of the New Testament take the form of a letter. And if you think about the world's scriptures globally, that's very unusual as a way for a body of sacred writings to come together. There are other features we could say, but those are just a couple as we turn to the 400-year story. Now, this timeline looks daunting, but we're not going to talk about all of them. As you look at the timeline, I put asterisks by certain ones on the handout. And the asterisks are events that I consider important to that catalyzed New Testament canonization, or that gave energy to the process of canon formation. So let's look at this timeline. As I said, we've got the epistles you see there, the Gospels. We have other texts that are being written around the same time in different genres, texts that are about instruction and worship, texts that are visionary, texts that are trying to explain why emerging Christianity is different than Judaism, such as the Epistle of Barnabas. Texts which are not ultimately in the canon of the New Testament that you have in the pews here, but which were widely disseminated and highly influential at the time. But likely the first catalyst toward canonization was whoever started to compile Paul's letters. So Paul writes a letter to Rome. Paul writes letters to Corinth, a city in Greece. Paul writes other letters, some to individuals. How did those get in this Bible in the pew, right? To individuals. And so whoever it was, we guess around 100 or so, that started to get copies of those and say, let's find out what Paul wrote to Rome. Let's find out what Paul wrote to Ephesus, a city in modern-day Turkey, and let's put those together. That is the first moment of collection, we think. I think. I'll speak for myself. I think. So every canon process is fundamentally, if you're a visual learner, you can look at me right now. Every canonization process is fundamentally both this and this, right? Every asterisk here does one of these or one of these. And so the compilation of Paul's letters is the first one of this. It's more positive, right? Hey, there's some good stuff in all these. Let's bring them together into a set, a greatest hits or something, right? But then something else starts to happen, going the other direction. If we jump down to the next couple asterisks, two names, Valentinus and Marcion. I won't ask if you've ever heard of them. I doubt you have. Maybe you heard of Marcion someday. This is not Saint Valentine, by the way. That's a different Valentine. So it was a fairly common name in Latin. So this is amazing. So the attempt to make them heretics has worked, right? Because you don't know their names now, 2,000 years later. But they were immensely popular Christian leaders. At least they thought of themselves absolutely as Christians. And why are they on my list? So Valentinus, less important of the two. Valentinus is on my list because he had interpretations of Christian theology that were written in such a compelling way. You might think of a very charismatic speaker who's giving great sermons, but they were a little bit different than what a lot of other Christian theologians were preaching at the time. But he was gaining such a large following both in Egypt and in Rome. He was almost elected Bishop of Rome, later known as the Pope. Very, very, very popular. He was so popular that people who disagreed with him, they all started writing against him. So we have many, many texts from the 2nd century called Against Valentinus. Like, that's just the title. Right? They're not mincing any words. Against Valentinus. The threat, I think, was what we can imagine, like the threat of a charismatic leader who's very gifted with eloquence, but whose ideas not everyone agrees with. And they were more esoteric ideas and potentially had different views of salvation. And there was one of them that the first line of it was the gospel of truth. It was the beginning of a sentence. But that kind of came to be the title. And so people attacked him for this, that he's writing a new gospel. He's trying to write a gospel that's only his truth, and he's deceiving people. So Valentinus was the first kind of attempt for many other Christians to say, wait a minute, we need to maybe do some more defining of which gospels are allowed, because he's got a text called a gospel of truth that's in circulation. But Marcion was a much, much more important figure in this 400-year story. Marcion, modern-day Turkey, mid-2nd century, extremely popular Christian teacher and leader who created a canon. So, a little trivia question, or a final exam question if it's class, who created the first Christian canon? And it's not one of the people whose names you know. It's Marcion, and what he did was he took the letters of Paul and the Gospel of Luke, and he metaphorically, cut out the parts of Luke that he didn't agree with, and then he put all that together and said, this is it. So that was a very affirmative move to say he was going to create, this is all we need, and this is sufficient. And this was another catalyst, because then everyone else who was reading, for example, the Gospel of Matthew or the Gospel of John, they obviously had an opinion about that and why he did it. But he went farther than this. Marcion decided that the God of the Hebrew Scriptures, the God of Israel, was not the same God as the God revealed through Jesus. And Marcion said, they're two different. Jesus is teaching a different message than the God of Israel, so the whole Hebrew Scriptures is out. All of it. So, pretty dramatic moves and major catalysts. So guess what? There's lots and lots of texts from the 2nd century titled Against Marcion. You got it. You're following the thread here. So this is the beginning of heresy, the beginning of the production of heresy, right? Heresy is a category, right? Heretic is a harsh word. A heresy is a category. It really comes from a Greek word meaning a school of thought, people who think a certain way. And so you have people who have a very strong, defined school of thought like Marcion, which necessitates a response from everyone else who may not agree with this. So who is the most important figure who definitely doesn't agree with these two, his name is Irenaeus. He's a bishop of Lyon, modern-day France, which is a Roman city at the time, a Roman-founded city. Irenaeus, masterful writer and masterful boundary creator, right? So if we think of the first person to start kind of defining who's a heretic and who's not, he's your guy. So if you're into that, you love him. If you're not into that, you're not going to like him at all. But he writes 5 treatises against Valentinus. He writes voluminously against Marcion, and he gives every argument you can imagine and some that you couldn't imagine about these various figures. And now in so doing, he's the first to really articulate a strong sense of 4 Gospels. So here in the late 2nd century, we have a figure who has significant authority, not only as a bishop, but also as a gifted writer and thinker, who is making a strong case for 4 Gospels, and only these 4, the ones that are in your Pew Bible of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Okay, but even if as I say that, there's another asterisk that I skipped, which is that there's lots of other stuff in circulation, right? There's other Gospels in circulation. There are other books of Acts in circulation, Acts are stories of what Jesus' followers did in the years afterwards, right? Whether they went to Syria or they went to Egypt or they went up north. And so there's many, many things in circulation. So it's not as if when we get to Irenaeus, it's done, just because he said so, or just because a couple other people said so. The story's definitely not over there. In the next couple centuries, we have dramatic growth of Christianity, and we have some intense conflict over that Christian growth. Right? When a culture changes gradually, there tends not to be much conflict. When a culture changes rapidly, conflict ensues. You can populate your mind with whatever story from our lives we know this to be true. So there are some large-scale persecutions during this time, especially in 250 and 303. But ultimately, one of the Roman emperors, Constantine, does convert to Christianity. One of the moments in history that is not overrated. Excuse me. It's one of these that is as big of a deal as it seems to be, right? The Roman emperor converting to Christianity, and has just countless effects on everything after that. But just for the topic today, what are the effects? One is Christians have money now. All of a sudden, there is the bank spigot is open or whatever. The interest rates are low. No, it's imperial wealth, like the wealth that is so concentrated in the Roman Empire, now has been opened for church buildings, for church art, for construction projects. Constantine's giving private buildings to be made into churches. Okay, but none of that is about the New Testament. What's about the New Testament is that while Bibles now are not expensive, and actually you can get them for free if you want one, at the time, a Bible, if you were to put all the texts of our Bible into a book, it would be, like the size of this podium, and 2 volumes this high, or maybe even more. It would be made with parchment, animal skin and leather and hand copy. Hand copied for who? Well, maybe 5% of the population can even read. These are luxury items. Why in the world would you do that? Have all of this, spend all this time and money to produce these things? Well, after the imperial wealth flows in, this makes some more sense. And Constantine also wants that to happen because his desire is for more unity among Christians and among different Christian factions. So there's a consolidation of ideas and of doctrine, and also a funding that it is able to produce books. Now, it just so happens that some of those books survived. Not many, but some did. And if you turn the page on your handout, We can think about canon formation also through lists and collections that have come down through history. This is a difficult handout to read, I know. If you look at the right side of this page, these are the major collections or codices. A codex is what we think of as a book. It was a new technology at the time, replacing the scroll. These are the major codices from the 4th and 5th century, and see there are 5 of them reading across. This is the right side of this page of the handout. And it's possible that a couple of these are from that period of book production after Constantine, when finally the funding was there and the will was there. And what do we see on these codices? Well, we see a pretty stable core of the kind of the texts that are in there: Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, Acts, Romans, names that sound familiar, James, 1 Peter. But I want to draw your attention to the bottom of the collections. We have, and I've put little lines by these, we have Barn, which is Barnabas, Herm, which is Hermas, 1 Clement, 2 Clement, and texts like that. Now, these are texts that I had listed on the timeline as existing, right? But they're not in the Bible that's here in the pew at Watch Hill Chapel. So I want us to hold in our minds two things that are true, and a little bit of tension. One is that in the 400-year story, by the end of it, there was a quite stable set of texts that were in wide circulation and considered authoritative. True. Also true, the boundaries were fuzzy on the edges, right? You might have one more text over here in Syria, another text over here in North Africa, another text here in Rome, another text here in Egypt, that were copied at the end of the codex. On the last pages, say, well, this is still a text that we enjoy reading and we think it's useful for reading. So a stable core and fuzzy boundaries. If you look at the left side of the handout, you see a similar set of lists, but let's take one example where it says African canons. This is a 4th century or early 5th century list that is almost the same, or almost exactly the same as what's in your Pew Bible here at Watch Hill Chapel. But in that list, they also say it's okay to read the texts of the martyrs. So they've given the list of 27 that is the same as this, but they're also saying, but if you stand up in church and read the story of your favorite martyr instead of the Bible that day, that's okay, right? So there's a kind of way of thinking here where, yes, there's a canon of text, but there's also a canon of use. Like, how are people actually using texts, right? How are they using them in church and in worship? And so that the next line on your handout there, as I say, so we have canon formation of lists and collections, but we also have canon formation as assessed by frequency of use. You know, what are people actually doing in church with texts? How are we doing? Doing okay? Enjoying class? So you had a 3-speaker series. Is there a final exam? Is there like, you bring it all together? I'll have to talk to Professors Baden and Vanderkam and we'll come up with something. Now, I want to be very, as a professor, I'm always trying to be honest about what is consensus views and what are my own views. I would say the 400-year story that I've just articulated is pretty consensus, pretty standard. If you go to an intro New Testament class at many different universities, the 400-year story of this and this, right? You're going to hear a lot of that with a lot of the same figures and a lot of the same catalysts. But I want to conclude with the 1500-year story, which I don't think you would hear everywhere. I think it's one that you'll hear more. You'll hear more and more going forward as the topic of biblical reception history is taken more seriously. But it's not the most common one. But it is the approach I take in a book I just finished. I'm not trying to sell you the book, but a manuscript I just finished, which is about how Catholics have encountered the Bible over their history. And this is where I really started to think about the 1,500-year story of the formation of the biblical canon. Because for most of, so let's say 75% of Christian history, there's no printing press, right? 75%, up till 1,500, there's no printing press. There's also a very, very low literacy rate. So the vast majority of Christians don't have this, right? They're still Christian. They still think they are. They're living their lives. They're believing things. They're hearing stories. But they don't have one of these. So when we think about the canon as proclaimed and preached and visualized, by visualized I mean literally imaged with with paintings and stained glass and stuff, we get a slightly different look at what the New Testament is. And so I want to conclude with that 1,500-year story. One way to say it is that the Bible looked less like this and more like the last page of your handout. Less like this and more like the last page of your handout in this era before print culture became dominant. So we might ask, when we look at this triptych painting, which I've had much occasion to look at because it's in New York and where I take my students, if we look at this late medieval triptych painting, it helps us to imagine the New Testament for someone before the printing press. They've heard a sermon, they've prayed, they've heard a reading or two, but they don't have the text with them, they've just listened to it, and they see images. And when they see images, they see a canon within the canon, right? They have a visual biblical canon that they're working with. And I can tell you, you have to trust me, but I just spent 5 years working on this book. I can tell you that what they see for these 1,500 years is very centered on the Gospels and the Psalms. So that's not New Testament, of course, but the way the Psalms are interpreted in the New Testament is a big part of what they're seeing and what they're hearing. And you might especially think of the twin figures of Jesus and Mary at the center of this proclaimed and visualized canon within the canon. So what we see on this triptych, you can guess that in the center, small group time again, right? In the center, you see the birth, the nativity scene itself. It's a little hard to see, but on the right side, you can see three figures looking up into the sky, seeing a vision. These are the three wise men who come to greet the infant Jesus. In the background, they're taking a bath in a river. I think it's been a long walk, and they want to be clean, for this event. So we see nativity on the right and the visit of these three wise men and their journey. But then on the left, the far left, we see the Virgin Mary with her relative Elizabeth, mother of John the Baptist, and the babies are talking in the womb to each other, leaping in the womb. But then there's this panel on the near left where there's this figure in a red robe who's kneeling with incense, looking up in the sky through a window. And this is one where if I had no tour guide or had no historical placard on the wall at the museum, it would have taken me a very long time to figure out what this is. And I'm a professor who studies this stuff. But the reason is, it's not in the Bible. It's not even close. It's from the medieval Golden Legend, which is a very popular story circulating throughout medieval Europe. And it's a story about the Roman emperor getting a prophecy that a new king had been born. And the Roman emperor paying homage to a vision through a prophecy of this new king being born. And when you see it that way, then there's a coherence to the whole picture that the kind of kings from the east have come to pay homage, the wise men from the east have come to pay homage, and The Roman king in the west is also paying homage, but through a different kind of prophecy, through one he's receiving from a Roman prophetess, a Sibyl who's standing there delivering a message. And he's also paying homage. But the viewer, this pre-printing press viewer, has no idea that that one panel is not in what comes to be in your pew Bible, and that all the other panels are. Right? That everything else is part of what comes to be the New Testament, except this one panel is not. So considering the prevalence of images like this, and I could have picked so many others, can we really say the canon is closed in the year 1400? Can we even say at this time that it's closed? We could argue about it, but what I am proposing here is that if we think in a 1500-year story, we can say that perhaps no. Perhaps no, it's not even closed then. So what happens? Last bullet point. Always be careful, though, when a professor says finally, because sometimes we talk too long. But honestly, as my final bullet point here, the printing press and the Reformation, I think, are the end of the 1500-year story. Time Life magazine, if you remember that, did a millennium issue, which I had. I loved it. It was the 100 most important events of the millennium, came out in 2000. Number 3 was Martin Luther's 95 Theses in the Reformation. And number 1 was Gutenberg's Bible on the printing press. So it's not just me who thinks so. Numbers 1 and number 3, most important events, were the printing press and the Reformation. And they give you the final piece for what comes to be your Christian canon. Because you could summarize the Reformation in a lot of ways, but one way to summarize it is the printing press prints a bunch of Bibles, people start reading them, and they're like, wait a minute, there's a lot in here that's not in the church I go to, and there's a lot in the church I go to that's not in here. Okay, there you go. That's my one sentence summary of the Reformation, otherwise known as sola scriptura, that one comes to knowledge and salvation through Scripture alone. And so Martin Luther is the primary person associated with this. So a more official formation of the canon really comes through the printing press, the Reformation, and then the Catholic response to that, when the Catholic Council of Trent says, wait a minute, okay, these are our texts, for sure these are ours, we've had them for all this time, you guys are going to do your own thing with the Reformers, and especially Luther, and then Luther translates his own Bible, the Luther Bible, into German, and we're off and running, right? And then we have all the Reformation that comes in its wake. I talked about the canon in the canon with the Gospels and the Psalms. I talked about the canon within the canon in the early church. We have one for Luther as well. What happens at this period? Paul's epistles come roaring back in power, especially Romans, which Luther says is a brilliant light enough to illumine the whole Bible. It can never be read too often or too much. And so Romans becomes that centerpiece of Protestant theology. If you go to a truck stop still today, in the middle of the United States, you can find a little pamphlet that will say the Romans Road. Follow the Romans Road to salvation. Straight from Luther to a truck stop today, saying the canon within the canon of the Bible are these few steps that you can read in Paul's letters towards salvation. So perhaps that 1500-year story is still a 2,000-year story, right? That's kind of coming right up to the present. Well, my time is up. So in the end, what do we have? We have a 100-year story, I think that's quite simple to understand, a 400-year story, that's what you would get in a college classroom, and then a 1,500-year story that you get like Peppard's ideas about another way to think this through. And I'm comfortable with multiple stories, multiple ways of telling the same story of the formation of the New Testament, and so I hope that you are. There's an ancient Jewish proverb that helps me feel good about this, which is, they say, why did God create human beings? Because God loves stories. So we'll leave you with that. Thank you for listening. Appreciate it.